The Awakening from the Fempiror Chronicles by George Willson. Chapter 3. Hauginstown. David Taylor was a handsome, well-built young man with sharp blue eyes and short brown hair, and on this day he churned a shirt in a barrel of blue dye. It was boring, tedious work, and his father had only assigned him this duty because at the age of 17 he was the youngest of the 3 Taylor brothers. He hated it, but also understood the necessity of it. After all, it was his family's work to be purveyors of garments, and it was his duty to learn it. This is not to say that he was a master of the trade by any means. No, the privilege of learning the finest ins and outs of the tailoring business had gone to his oldest brother, James, who not only displayed mastery, but also shared ownership of the family business with his father, Jonathan. David and his other brother Mark could choose to continue working in Hauginstown or to take the family trade to another town to make their own lives. While David at least understood the business, Mark was, in David's opinion, completely incompetent at it and did not intend to leave Hauginstown to go anywhere. It was also David's opinion that Mark should be out here in the alley churning the dyeing shirt to allow David more experience in the shop. But, knowing Jonathan, this was not to be. The youngest always performed the menial tasks around the shop. That's just the way it was, and until James married and had children old enough to do this, it would be David's lot for as long as he remained. And David did not want to remain. His father had denied him the heart of the business for so long that there were times he no longer wanted to be a tailor. Unfortunately, clothing was all he knew anything about, but he still longed to see what lay outside of his little world of Hauginstown. As he slowly churned the shirt in its barrel, his mind wandered to the unknown places he had never been, the places he longed to see. Stories he had heard of the rest of the world came solely from the more learned and traveled men of the town when they returned from these other places, with tales of music they compared to the singing of angels, of buildings that looked like monuments to the gods, and of books they had been privileged to read in great libraries. David had never been anywhere, not even to the mountains west of town, and he could only read a tape measure and drawings of patterns. In his position, nothing else was required. He sighed as he snapped from his faraway thoughts and gazed around him. The alley was about the most ordinary place in the world. The walls of the stores were unfinished wooden brown, the ground was dirt and also brown. The barrel was brown, the stick was brown, the doors were brown, and the fence with the gate leading out of the alley to the town square was brown. Could one be in a browner world, he wondered. The only points of color were the water, which maintained its brilliant blue, the clothesline that possessed a rainbow of colors from the dyes that had seeped into it, and the washing kettle at the back of the alley, which was a deep black and not really a color. Even David provided no source of color as he wore brown breeches, off-white wool stockings, and an almost white shirt that was tinged with, of course, brown. His waistcoat and hat rested on a hook on the outside wall of the shop, placed there by David for days such as this, not wanting to risk ruining those items with the dye. He was sent to the alley after Mr. Franklin had decided the new shirt his father had finished for him only last week needed to be blue, after he had returned from one of his travels with a supply of Prussian blue dye for Jonathan Taylor. His father had tried to talk him into a new shirt, since dyeing a finished shirt would not yield the same high-quality results as dyeing new fabric, but Mr. Franklin insisted, so they would do their part. David had been sewing, another job for a tailor's table monkey, when his father had told him to head out and fire up the large kettle that they washed the fabric in prior to dyeing it. While the shirt was in the hot water, he had carefully mixed the Prussian blue dye in the barrel they always used for dyeing in preparation for the shirt to receive its deep blue color. After the shirt was in the barrel, he continually and carefully stirred it around with the stick that had been whittled down to a very soft end, so it would not damage the fabric, to ensure that the dye would soak through the fabric evenly. He glanced at the shadows in the alley and guessed that it had been nearly enough time for the dye to soak in. Soon he would remove it from the barrel and dry it on the rainbow-colored line before washing it in the kettle again, but this time in cold water. He closed his eyes again and tried to listen to the voices of the faces he was unable to see outside the alley where the world was a little greener. He wondered why they had a fence anyway. No one steals anything in Hauginstown. If he could see out, at least he would have a green view of the town square. "Good afternoon, Mr. Taylor," a familiar voice sounded over the fence. He heard his father respond from inside the shop, and a moment later Abraham Barber opened the gate and entered the alley. Abraham was only a few months younger than David, and being cousins, David's mother was Abraham's father's sister. The two were inseparable friends. Abraham had a hard, chiseled face, far removed from David's softer appearance, with dark blue eyes and reddish hair that often hung over his ears, an irony given that his father was the town's barber. His clothes were the same style as almost everyone else in Hauginstown, since the Taylor family made the majority of the town's clothing. He wore brown breeches, light stockings, a simple white wool shirt, a brown waistcoat, and a wide-brimmed hat. Simple elegance, his father called it. As they knew each other so well, David knew exactly what Abraham had come to talk about. The town had no secrets, and the tavern keeper's tale of the attack on Ben Thurman from the previous night was nearing legendary status already. What could throw a man around the town square, force an otherworldly scream from him, and then carry him off before anyone could respond? Still, David would have to play along for a while to appease his friend, and to see if anything new had come out. "Good afternoon, Abraham," David said, unable to help the boredom coming through his voice. "Did you hear about last night?" Abraham asked right away. He is not wasting any time, David thought to himself. "Which version?" he asked. "What have you heard?" David had been in the alley for a couple of hours. It was all anyone talked about, and he had heard wafting stories of all kinds, everything from an unknown wanderer attacking Ben to God himself striking Ben down for his drunken ways. David was certain that if anyone would know what really happened by now, it would be Abraham. He also knew that Abraham would have sorted through the stories, so David would get about as close to the truth as he could. "I know he didn't come home," David answered. "Did they find him yet?" "They're not going to," Abraham replied. "I heard he was attacked." "Says who?" David asked. "Says the keeper at the Willson tavern," said Abraham. "He says that old Ben had had too much to drink last night and was stumbling home when—" "I hear that happens every night," David interrupted. He knew the interruption would rile Abraham into telling even more, and Abraham really disliked David's interjections of blunt fact into his stories. "You know," David continued, "one time we found him all the way out by the old miller's place east of town, half dead of thirst after 2 days. David was actually one of the people to find Ben on that occasion, though only Abraham would know why he had been there at the time. The miller's place was an old, long-abandoned windmill that passers-by used primarily as a landmark near town, as well as a temporary shelter in the wide-open European landscape. "Let me finish, David. This is different," Abraham said. "Mr. Witt said he was attacked by a creature with glowing red eyes and wings and—" "A what?" David laughed. He found this to be beyond ridiculous, but Abraham continued with the tale, ignoring David's interjection. "It chased him around the town square, picked him up and threw him like a rag doll before this thing leaned over him at the end. Mr. Witt thinks it was drinking his blood." "You can't be serious," David said, chuckling. "The mayor's declared no one should be out after dark just in case," Abraham finished. David shook his head in total dismay at the foolishness of the whole situation. "I think all of you are drunk off the tavern keeper's wares to believe in that nonsense," he said. "But after last night?" Abraham asked. David laughed. "Last night, Ben probably upset someone, and they took out their rage on him," he said. "What about this thing throwing him around the square?" Abraham challenged, unconvinced. "Who knows?" David said with a shrug. "Only Witt saw it, and Lord knows what he'd been drinking." "Mr. Witt is not known for making up stories, you know," Abraham reminded him. David nodded. Abraham was right. Barleyman Witt was not a man who was even capable of spinning a yarn, much less make up something this far-fetched. He was known to exaggerate, and there was no doubt that Ben was missing. David was convinced that Witt had seen something last night, but a flying devil with wings and glowing eyes was out of the question. He looked back at Abraham and started to say something else, but he noticed Abraham was staring at the barrel. "What are you doing?" Abraham asked. David raised the churning stick out of the dark water to show Abraham his very wet lump of fabric. Despite their lifelong friendship, Abraham never seemed to grasp what David did. David never had any problem with this, as he never grasped what Abraham and his family did either. "What is that?" Abraham asked him, looking at the dripping mass at the end of David's stick. "It's Mr. Franklin's," David explained. "All the menial work still falls to me, so I am out here dyeing the shirt. Washed it in the kettle before that. I'll be drying it here in a moment." David lowered the shirt back into the barrel and continued to churn it. Abraham watched it for a moment before the door on the side of the shop opened. Jonathan Taylor, a large, middle-aged man with a kind, nurturing face and trimmed mustache and beard, stepped into the alley and walked over to David carrying a white wool shirt. "How's that shirt coming along?" Jonathan asked. David dutifully raised the shirt again without a word. Although he disliked the work, he took pride in it. Careful not to touch it, Jonathan inspected the dyed shirt. He nodded. "Excellent," he said. "Give it some time to dry, and then wash the excess dye out. In the meantime, you can start on this one." David's shoulders sank. "Another one?" he asked incredulously. "Also Mr. Franklin's," Jonathan explained, handing David the shirt. David took it dutifully. "How long am I going to be out here today? I wanted to help inside," David said. "David," Jonathan began. David knew that tone of voice. Jonathan had used it many, many times, usually when David was complaining about something. The life of a tailor is not always easy. Sometimes the simplest jobs are the longest and the most important. "But how long?" David insisted. "Dry this one, and while it's drying you can start washing the new one," his father replied. "Hopefully you'll get them both done today." David opened his mouth to say something more, but his father's no-nonsense look kept him quiet. Mr. Franklin wanted them today. David nodded and looked back at the barrel in defeat. "Yes, sir," was all David could manage. Jonathan turned back to the door but paused and looked at David. "Go ahead and take a break while that one dries and the water heats," he said. 5 minutes should be plenty." David nodded. "Thank you, sir," he said. David raised the shirt up over the line, carefully avoiding the drips. He had become rather good at transferring wet fabric from the barrel to the line, though he normally removed his shirt for this. Jonathan looked at it for a moment, and then back to David. "Don't forget to turn it when you get back to dry the other side," he said. "And get that fire going again so the water's warmed as well." David nodded again. "Yes, sir," he said, and walked to the tinder box sitting next to the kettle to work on restarting the fire he had put out just after he had placed the shirt in the dye barrel. Jonathan's middle son, Mark, who was 21 and looked like a gangly version of Jonathan, but with his clothes in perpetual disarray, stuck his head out the door into the alley. "Father, Mr. Diddle gained weight since we measured him, and now his pants don't fit," Mark whined. David looked up from his tinder and rolled his eyes. He knew exactly how to correct this particular problem, but somehow Mark never seemed to grasp it, so their father always helped him through it. David was sure that when their father could no longer work in the shop, James would continue to help Mark through his shortcomings. "That's what family does," his father would have said. "I'll be right there," Jonathan told Mark. He turned back to David. 5 minutes after you get that fire going," he said, and then walked into the shop, closing the door behind him. David stared after him without a smile. He looked back to Abraham, who smirked and apparently enjoyed the entire exchange. David had told him many times about his frustrations, and Abraham's rather cruel enjoyment of it never sat well with David. David rekindled the fire under the now cooling water in the kettle. He stood, pulled the churning stick from the barrel, and held it before him like a sword. "You know," David said, "there are days when I'd just like to—" With that, he swung the stick like a sword in a narrow figure-8 pattern in front of and behind him, twisting himself around the alley and narrowly missing the clothesline, the hanging shirt, the walls of the shops, and the barrel. Abraham took a step back, his mouth opening in disbelief. David released his mock sword, and it plopped harmlessly into the barrel. Abraham stared at him. "You do that much?" he asked. "I spend a lot of time in this alley," David replied, retrieving his waistcoat and hat from the hook. "Let's go."